So, we made a podcast. Welcome to Pressgang is the name we decided on. My name is Calvin. I use he, him, and I guess welcome to us learning how Zencastr works. I'm joined by
Eric, who also uses he, him, and also doesn't know how Zencastr works.
It is an ancient and arcane device that we are completely confused by at all times. Yeehaw. And welcome to a podcast about playing historicals unseriously.
Yeah, really the goal behind this podcast is to sort of follow our journey as we look at historical war games as part of the larger miniatures hobby, and do so in a way where we're not taking ourselves very seriously. Neither one of us are, professors of history or, professional reenactors or all the many very things that end with you having very, very deeply held opinions about what particular regiments wore in what particular year.
Yeah, it turns out button counters are a scourge upon the earth occasionally. Was that too rough? I mean, I love minutiae as much as like the next person who gets into historical wargaming.
I think the real thing is whether or not you end up in that place. Historical wargaming as a hobby struggles a bit with getting new people into it. And I think a lot of that is the intimidation factor of feeling like you need to do things absolutely correctly and like there are particular answers, even when often actually historically there aren't. And so that's part of it is we'd like to approach this in a way that we think is slightly more accessible to folks, and hopefully help people who are interested get into working on historical projects as part of their larger hobby.
Yeah, I mean, as much as like I enjoy, for example, one of the people who might know a bit more than us about historical things, Martin from Seventh Son. Love his work, but occasionally his stuff seems a little bit dense and impenetrable, where it's like, hey, here's War of the Roses, and here I'm painting this weird lord no one's ever heard of, and here's the research on this and this and this. It's like, I just want to smash plastic toys together, man. Where do I start there?
Exactly. So, should we move on to our first segment, which is sort of what we're working on right now, how we're approaching this at the moment?
Yeah. I mean, I did write notes for this. I suppose we should vaguely follow them. So
I am trying to vaguely follow them.
Look at us being professional and whatnot. Would you like to go first with what the models you're working on right now are?
Sure. So, if this podcast survives more than 2 episodes, folks will quickly learn that I am slow, and that my primary thing I'm working on is whatever I was working on the last time there was an episode. So right now, Calvin and I are playing a sort of mini and informal 30 Years War campaign using Pikeman's Lament as a rule set. I painted some horses for that and then sort of stalled out on that, and so now I'm trying to paint the riders. So I've got a unit of 6 dragoons and 2 units of 6 heavy horse that need paint on them, and that's what I'm working on right now for historicals. And then also the 3D printer, which counts as hobby progress if I own it, is sort of obediently churning away various different terrain projects to help support that game and some others we've got planned in the future.
I'm actually really excited to see those dragoons done, considering last game we played, they did so much work.
Yeah, I think the failure state for dragoons is pretty horrible, but when they work real well.
Truly. And in contrast to Eric, as soon as if this podcast lasts more than 2 episodes, you'll learn that I paint quickly. Currently, I recently finished my company, I guess is the term they use for army, for Pikeman's Lament, and I've been going down another rabbit hole slightly of the Anglo-Zulu War and painting some nice redcoats to die on the fields of South Africa. In addition, with those mentioned, 3D printing, I did prime up all the buildings for that farm. So hopefully those will get painted this week at some point.
Yeah, I printed up for our games a 28mm French farm compound, I guess is the best word to put it, that will make a nice centerpiece model for 28mm games, and will work in, I think, a number of different settings. So I'm excited to see that. We've got one building painted, and it looks great, and so I'm excited to see the whole thing come together, because I'm actually really pleased with how we're both members of the same wargaming club, Wheat Belt Wargaming in Moscow, Idaho, and I'm really pleased to see how our sort of historicals terrain collection is starting to come together.
Yeah, because I think it was like 2 or 3 months ago, or was it longer than that? That we had that terrain day where we actually went through everything we needed for a historical table.
Yeah, and that was honestly a huge amount of fun. To actually go through that and think about what we needed and what we meant when we said, oh, do you want to farm? That means farm fields and chicken coops and all kinds of things. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing that and getting to play on those tables, importantly.
Oh yeah.
And I guess the other thing I did forget to mention that I'm working on is I have sourced all the models and started to print the models that will be 3D printed for some Austrians for Silver Bayonet, which may or may not count as a historical game, depending on if you think vampires are real. But is at least historically vibing.
I think that's good. Also, that'll be a discussion later for talking about just playing historical games at a very chill level, is looking at things like Last War, Gloom Trench, Silver Bayonet, all those kind of weird, vaguely historical games.
Yeah.
I think being able to look at those and that'll come later where we talk about kind of what we're calling historical games and kind of looking at it from a more relaxed perspective. Also, speaking about what games we're working on, I did recently get my hard copy for The Men Who Would Be Kings, and immediately I thought, I could do the second invasion of Afghanistan. That could be fun.
Yeah, what empire hasn't had a good invasion of Afghanistan that promptly failed?
I mean, Graveyard of Empires. Romans, Russians, British, Americans.
Yeah. I, at some point, I think it was in Foreign Policy, read a really interesting article that was just what is it about Afghanistan's position on the map of the world that makes it what it is? And yeah, it's just it's a vortex that one should not go in. Never get involved in a land war in Asia.
I mean, any part of Asia.
That's our history pro tip.
Don't do it. So the next general vague thing on our format, if you want to go there, is our kind of talking about whatever our episode is actually going to be about. And in this case, it's probably going to be what do we do? Or why are we here? What is our point for historical wargaming, and what kind of games do we want to look at? And the notes I have it specifically as, why this goddamn podcast?
And I think that the reason for this podcast, beyond the fact that, I am at least a middle-aged white dude, and Calvin is a middle-aged white dude in his soul, and thus, we should start a podcast, is something at some point we said to each other. Really, the reason for this is I think there's a lot of ways to get into miniature wargaming as a hobby, and I think a lot of people are, for better or worse, with what 40K has become recently, have started looking abroad for various different wargaming options. But I think, as we sort of alluded to, I think there's a very steep curve to looking at historicals for a number of different reasons. One is as we referred to, the sort of button counters idea of, okay, but I don't actually know what, Prussian infantry in 1807, what color their buttons were. I need to go look that up. And Osprey has probably written a book on Prussian button design in the Napoleonic Wars. But one thing is that looking at places where that doesn't necessarily matter. So one of the reasons I have been so particularly fond of the 30 Years' War is that nobody really had uniforms. And so nobody had them. Paint your dudes the way you want. Buff coats should probably be painted buff, and that's about it. And so I think that there's an interest in sort of that. And then also one of the things I do want to talk about that occurred to me last night as I was playing with little 15 millimeter, both pikemen and Napoleonic dudes. I think that historical wargaming often comes off as fairly intimidating because the battles you see if you think about a game like Age of Sigmar or Warhammer 40,000, a lot of the spectacle and pageantry comes from having a very terrain-heavy table and this sort of, futuristic battlefield look to it. I think a lot of historical games, which are honestly both historically accurate and also terrain-light in that regard, rely on the spectacle of the number of toy soldiers you have on the board at any given time. And so, you can have a very intimidating thing where if you're interested in, say, hypothetically 15 millimeter Napoleonics, which I just bought from Warlord, you get a box with hundreds of figures in it. And with how painting has improved, with people being able to have, tutorials and being exposed to painting techniques on the internet and all the tools we have. Hey, low-key paint a couple hundred guys is sort of a terrifying prospect. And so part of the idea behind this is, again, that idea of sort of a chill approach to historical wargaming where, in the future, maybe we talk about some shortcuts we used. I have been a big fan of contrast paint.
Contrast paint!
Because contrast paints are amazing and are really great for it's pretty okay and it's done. And I think one of the things that you forget when you start thinking about the spectacle is the number of troops, is also any individual given dude doesn't need a second layer of edge highlights because there's 100 and something of them. And they're in ranks, so you can't see the guys behind you. So breaking out some of those old Warhammer fantasy battles, you paint the first rank and you dry brush the second and third sort of approach to things. So I think that's really the interest we have, is trying to make things accessible, talking about historical skirmish games, talking about, painting techniques, building terrain, hobby ADD, which I definitely have, and things like that. So Calvin, why are you interested?
For me, a lot of the history stuff comes from being a bit of a nerd and having a dad who I'm fairly certain was probably somewhere neurodivergent, considering the amount of Civil War battlefields I visited as a kid. Between that and like the classic quote-unquote dad interest in like World War II, really sparked my interest there, and following that, like kind of a very big love of tanks led me into World War II stuff originally. And then I decided, I just woke up one morning and it's like, well, I'm either going to start doing trains or start doing historicals. And I started ranting about Napoleon. I kind of blacked out there for a moment, and that's how I ended up picking up some Napoleonics at 28 mil, which is a horrid choice. That is definitely something that I'm paying for, is doing Napoleonics at 28 mil is a horrifically intimidating task. As mentioned before, it's 100 models at least for each of my armies. However, the other thing I wanted to try to do with this podcast is show that you don't have to be scared, because there's often a bit of I wouldn't say like oh god, what's the best way to put this? Words are hard. Historicals are an interest to me because I like history in the first place. Getting to do gaming with it allows me to like kind of participate in these moments or these interesting things, and hunting down minutia is a fun thing for me. And sometimes when I look at, stuff, or most of the, I guess, content I see for historical war games kind of has a lot of assumed knowledge behind it, where it's like, oh, how units in formation work. Oh, what color these uniforms are to start with. Like, there's not a lot of entry-level stuff for historical wargaming. And that's kind of where I was thinking with this. Just kind of, what's your first step into a historical game? Whatever it may be.
Yeah, and I think along those same lines, sort of Stage Whisper, not only do you not need to be intimidated by, the amount of models you need to paint and things like that, they don't have to be painted. Like Warlord came out and said it for both their Push of Pike and their Waterloo stuff. They're in different colored plastic for a reason. So, don't necessarily be afraid. And this is the thing I tell, people who are playing 40K, you don't need a fully painted army to start. It's nice to make progress. It's nice to have an army that looks good, and also painted models automatically look better than unpainted models, so your skill level can grow. But yeah, I think both of us, as a consequence of growing up as nerdy boys, have a little bit of an interest in history. I have deeply held opinions about World War II fighter planes, notably that the Spitfire is beautiful and God's most perfect aircraft. But in addition to that, I think, both of us come from a pretty strong, I'm going to say, wargaming lineage. My dad was a Hex Encounter gamer, and so I sort of came from that. And so when people ask me, when did you start the hobby? I sort of have to look at them and go like, well, define hobby.
Yeah.
Because if we're counting, my old battered copy of Tactics 2, I was 8. If we're talking about, sincerely playing Warhammer 40,000, or like my first official miniatures historical game, that answer is either I'm basically for 40K, it's 5th edition, and for, genuine historic games, it's this year, the year of our Lord 2023. So yeah. I think both of us come from a very familiar heritage.
When you suckered me into...
Yeah, I may have sucker punched Calvin's hobby progress and just been like, hey buddy, I'll play historical games with you as long as it's this one.
Yeah, it took you till this year to sucker me into, painting my own 30 Years War army.
And then in retaliation, I have ended up with a bunch of 15mm Napoleonics, and someday some British paratroopers are going to show up.
Indeed. Also, it just hit me that there's another thing you mentioned, there's like a demographic thing there too. Like, back to kind of go back to the beginning, you mentioned, being a middle-aged man and a middle-aged man in my soul. There's also a bit of like trying to fight the stereotype a little bit with historical war games of, I guess, trying to fight the stereotype of,
I do have a beard, neither one of us are wearing suspenders.
Old gray man in corner playing historical games. I am a spry 25 trying to do this stuff, and making it more accessible seems like a good plan to me.
Yeah, I think more accessible, a little bit less old man yells at clouds. I think we both do have beards, but neither one of us are currently wearing suspenders. We may devote an episode to that because it happens occasionally, and it's worth talking about as something the hobby struggles.
All right.
So, post behind the scenes technical difficulty, where were we?
Something I was going off a little bit about kind of inclusivity and trying to break the stereotype of old gray man in corner playing game.
Yeah, I think the hobby does have, and we will probably do an episode at this point on this at some point, sort of an old man yells at clouds problem that we'd like to at least dispel a little bit. I mean, Calvin's a sprightly young man. I am not, but I would like to believe I'm not old yet, despite my beard slowly turning white. And more importantly, just trying to make sure that this is a hobby for everybody, and that if you're interested in working on this, that there is a welcoming community and a welcoming environment for you to be a part of that helps foster it. Because I mean, the thing that's true for all of these games is you need to be able to play with somebody. As much as I am interested in solitaire play, and we may have an episode on that as well at some point, it really is better with friends.
I've got something fun for when we talk about solo play, because it came actually in one of the books that I got recently. There's a whole chapter called Playing Mr. Babbage, which talks about playing solo.
Nice. That'll be fun to talk about, because I mean, one of the things that came out of both the pandemic and just not having time is occasionally I feel like wargaming at 3 a.m. And I have been kind enough not to call Calvin and be like, hey, meet me at the clubhouse. It's dark outside. So yeah.
I mean,
I bet I could probably get you into that, but this is not a path I should allow myself to go down.
Can't enable you anymore.
Exactly.
There was one other note I did also want to kind of hit on a little bit in this whole section, which is kind of talking about what we actually play, and the things that we personally have interest in when it comes to historicals. Because we obviously have a shared one of the 30 Years War and kind of the general pike and shot era. We do share the interest on the 30 Years War. I also add on that I do a lot of stuff for the Italian Wars, because I think it's kind of funny how a French king wanted an Italian kingdom and made that everyone's problem for 65 years.
These things happen from time to time. Who amongst us hasn't triggered a massive multi-party decades-long war? So I'm interested in a number of different things. Generally speaking, I have found that if you tell me, hey, could you be interested in something? My answer is always oh yeah, sure. So right now, I'm primarily focused on the 30 Years War simply because I need to focus on something to get things done. I also have an interest in Napoleon. I've always had an interest in Napoleon. Back when I was in high school, I had to write I was in the International Baccalaureate program, which is a glorified AP process, and we had to write a very long essay, and I wrote mine on Prussian military reform between 1805 and 1870. So I have a weakness for the Napoleonic period, and especially the Prussians. As someone put it, the great redemption story of the Napoleonic period, where they get overrun by Napoleon in the start, and they end up being instrumental in his downfall in the end, and what happens in between. So I do like the Napoleonic period. I think it's one that historicals, and we've mentioned this sort of pageantry aspect of historicals. The Napoleonic period is sort of the peak pageantry, unless potentially you are playing War of the Roses and go deep down the heraldry rabbit hole. And beyond that, like I said, I find a lot of things interesting. I've been interested in there's the notion of sort of imaginations and playing historicals that don't exist. As a concept, that's one I've found really sort of fascinating. Yeah, as I mentioned, I think I alluded to, I backed the Empress Miniatures Bridge Too Far Kickstarter, and so I'm gonna have a lot of little metal paratroopers come my way very soon. But yeah, that's sort of what I'm interested in. Like I said, I'm interested in most periods. It's probably easier to name the ones I'm not, and I'm struggling to find one right now.
Yeah, I personally, as one said, the shared 30 Years War. I think the Italian wars are interesting from kind of a color and military revolution standpoint. I also have several armies for Napoleonics at 28mm, both French and British. Although technically the British are my dad's that he's having me paint, but I mean, it's kind of fun to paint redcoats once in a while. I have been slowly, I have several World War II armies for bolt action, chain of command, what have you. My really big interest is in North Africa because I think desert warfare is neat, so much so to the point that I'm making a full long-range desert group army as soon as I check out the first Perry truck that I ordered. Yay, Perrys. I have a interesting bend. I tend to go later or more recent history than Eric does. For example, I've got a lot more World War II stuff, a lot more World War I stuff. I had an inkling to do Vietnam, and then my better instincts kind of told me not to. But then also it's like I do a lot of colonial conflicts, as I mentioned before, Anglo-Zulu War. And then apparently I can't get away from ancients either because my lovely boyfriend decided to enable me and bought me a box of Norman cavalry for the Crusades, so that's gonna happen at some point.
So that'll be a thing. I was very, very worried when you said I can't get away from ancients that somehow, without me knowing in the past couple days, you have bought a Macedonian army or something, because that would not be unlike you.
Oh no, I've got a Roman army. I have a full Roman century, 1-to-1 Roman century.
There you go.
On my shelf, half painted. So ancients are just calling to me at the worst case. I guess one thing that really gets me into gaming is, can I make some sort of artillery?
Yes, that will be a thing people discover. Calvin likes him a good cannon.
Big guns, trebuchets, ballista. I don't care. Give me the biggest gun.
Big thing that throws things far.
I want to play with it.
10 of 10 wood trebuchet again.
Yeah, whatever the copy pasta for the trebuchet, however big of rock, however many meters. I can remember off the top of my head.
Sadly, neither can I. So we'll delete this joke. No, for editor.
Or we'll leave it. Ari, leave the joke in. Ari, leave the joke in. But yeah, now it's just we're getting to our kind of conclusions. So ideas for future episodes, we've alluded to a couple throughout. We've got our idea for, looking at demographics and how to change that, because one of us knows a bit about data.
Yeah, I'm a stats nerd by profession. So thinking about data, thinking about sort of this hobby as sort of both how it has a perception problem and how it has a demographic problem, because it does. We've mentioned some other sort of ideas for perhaps specific periods. I think we could do a, quote unquote deep dive, even though it's not that deep, into the 30 Years War as sort of why we're both interested in it, why I think particularly it makes a really great entry point for historicals, and some other things. Per usual, I would love to do a historical terrain episode or a 3D printing episode, because that is becoming a bigger deal in the wargaming hobby generally. And yeah, I think there's definitely some others. Calvin, do you have anything you desperately want to touch on?
I think doing a series of episodes is kind of like an episode of what do I need to know to game this period, and doing one for I don't know, what do I need to know to do the War of Spanish Succession. We'll just use that as our whatever thing, stealing it from Hobby Support Group, where it's just kind of hey, I want to start playing this war. What do I need to know about armies? What do I need to know about finding models for them? Any other weird little quirks?
I think that's a big thing that is important for historical wargaming as a thing, is where do I buy models? Because if you're playing a Games Workshop game, you go to your Games Workshop store and you buy the models. End of story. Whereas for historicals, you gotta pick, and there's a lot of different sources, and a lot of those sources, some of them are great and super accessible. That is, I believe, why Warlord Games is what it is. But then there are others where it's these really cool people make these really cool miniatures, but they're only open the second Tuesday of every other month. And so, where do I buy models and who carries them and what sort of ranges are definitely something we'll try to cover, because that is very hard to sometimes find. And you get a lot of miniatures manufacturers who wrote their website once in 1996 and never updated it again. But they're still selling things, and often they're selling very cool things. So yeah, that's definitely something that we'll be covering, because it's a weird aspect of this part of the hobby.
Like, just off the top of my head, I'm thinking for my project for like my Zulu War stuff, it's like I've seen stuff for it from 4 different manufacturers, because Perry, Empress, Warlord, and I think I saw some Anglo-Zulu stuff from Pendraken, because I was looking for like 10 mil stuff sometimes. Mm-hmm. And it's like, oh look, what do you want to do? You can probably find it.
Yeah. And there is definitely occasionally price versus quality trade-off. There is a do you want metal miniatures trade-off, which is again something that hasn't confronted people in the sort of mainline Games Workshop part of the hobby in a long time. Is okay, but what happens when a bunch of white metal toy soldiers shows up on your desk? So yeah, that's definitely something we'll cover for a number of those segments. And so that's given us probably like 6 months worth of podcast episodes. So yay for us.
Yeah. Speaking of that, how often do we think these are going to come out?
No more frequently than once a month.
Yeah.
Just real talk time. We are both busy professionals, and there's a degree of difficulty in getting together for all things. Anyone who has ever had a D&D group will attest to the fact that getting multiple people in a room on a regular basis is the hardest part of playing D&D. So in an aspirational sense, probably once a month. In a realistic sense, probably once a month-ish.
Yeah. And, if people decide that they want more of us, I'm sure I could be convinced to, like, make a Patreon and have us do, like, I don't know, probably, like, some sort of stream stuff, or, yeah.
Smallish bonus episodes, hobby ASMR, various things.
Catching our rants about various things.
Yeah.
Oh, there's another episode idea that we could talk about, is problematic wargaming, where it's kind of like, talking about these conflicts of like, so you want to play the bad guys.
Yeah, and there are definitely ways to play the bad guys, and the bad guys do need to get played. And there are approaches to that, and there are bad approaches to that. So yay, another episode idea. But yeah, if people really, really like this and this takes off, we can revisit that scheduling idea. But realistically, for the moment, we're probably looking at about monthly. We hope.
Once again, you're gonna get what you pay for with this. So yeah. And then I guess this one was a shorter episode because we were just kind of going, hey, this is us. This is a podcast. And if you want to find us, for example, Eric, where can they find you?
So many places. So I do also have a Warhammer 40,000 podcast with Brian Harvey, formerly of the Splintermind. That is called Lost to the Nails. If you just search Lost to the Nails podcast in your various different podcasting apps, we're there. I also write a blog, Variance Hammer, that is my infrequently updated sort of stats nerdy quantitative look at wargaming. That's at variancehammer.com. And then finally I am on Twitter, the Hateful Bird site, at variancehammer.
And you can find me on the Hateful Bird site as Brushes and Jazz. You can also catch me streaming once or twice a week over at twitch.tv/nevermorepainting, where most of the time I'm painting models, but there's also at least once a week or twice a week that I'm doing Apex, because sometimes I need to turn my brain off and shoot things.
All right, so I think that's it for this episode. Thank you all for tuning in, and we hope you'll join us for our next attempt at this.
Yeah, hopefully it goes better with fewer technical difficulties. It won't. Just a hint, it won't.
Yeah, spoiler, it will not go better with less technical difficulties. But yes, thank you all very much for tuning in. This is the Plastic Press Gang.
Have a good day.